In the spring of 1944, a German test pilot climbed into an aircraft at the Dornier factory airfield at Oberpfaffenhofen in Bavaria and flew it level, not in a dive, not in a shallow descending run, but straight and level at 474 miles per hour. The official world airspeed record at the time was 469 miles per hour. The aircraft that had just exceeded it was not a jet. It had no rocket motor, no exotic propulsion system that belonged to the future rather than the present. It was a piston-engined fighter, powered by two conventional liquid-cooled reciprocating engines turning conventional propellers. What made it capable of those speeds was a configuration so unusual that no other production fighter in the history of aviation has ever replicated it. One engine in the nose, driving a tractor propeller at the front of the aircraft. One engine in the tail, driving a pusher propeller at the rear. Both engines in line with each other along the fuselage center line, producing the power of a conventional twin-engine fighter without any of the asymmetric drag that mounting engines on the wings creates. The aircraft was the Dornier 335 Pfeil, Arrow in German. By the time that speed run was made, the war had already turned decisively against Germany. The aircraft that had just outrun the world speed record would never fire its weapons in combat. By the time the first production examples reached conversion units, the Luftwaffe had no fuel to run them, no intact airfields to operate them from, and no pilots with the hours required to exploit what the aircraft could do. Germany built approximately 48 Dornier 335s across all variants before the factory was overrun. One survives. It sits today in the Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center of the National Air and Space Museum in Chantilly, Virginia, construction number 240102. The second pre-production A-0 built, assembled at Oberpfaffenhofen in April 1945, captured by American forces 6 days after it was completed, and eventually preserved as the sole surviving example of the fastest piston-engine fighter ever built. This is a story of that one aircraft, of how it came to exist, how it almost didn't, how it survived a war it never fought, and how the men who built it in 1945 came back 30 years later to restore it. The push-pull engine configuration that defined the D-335 was not a wartime improvisation. Claudius Dornier, founder of the Dornier Company, the engineer whose name was on every aircraft the firm built, had patented the concept in 1937. He had been thinking about centerline thrust twin-engine designs for years before the war began. The engineering logic was straightforward enough. Conventional twin-engine aircraft mount their engines on the wings, one on each side. This arrangement creates an asymmetric thrust problem. If one engine fails, the aircraft yaws violently toward the dead engine, demanding immediate and precise pilot input to maintain control. At low speed, during takeoff and landing, when any aircraft is most vulnerable, the asymmetric thrust from a failed outboard engine can overpower the rudder and kill the crew. A long and painful history of twin-engine accidents was written by this single engineering characteristic. Mounting both engines along the fuselage centerline eliminated the asymmetric thrust problem entirely. If the rear engine failed, the aircraft simply flew on the front one. There was no sudden yaw, no violent asymmetric moment. Test pilots who flew the D-335 on single-engine power reported that the transition was almost unremarkable. The configuration also offered a drag advantage. Wing-mounted engines with their nacelles and cooling systems and propeller discs created significant aerodynamic drag. Two engines tucked along the fuselage centerline offered a much cleaner aerodynamic profile, which was a direct contributor to the extraordinary speed numbers the D-335 produced. Dornier had been developing this concept through an experimental aircraft, the Göppingen Go-9 testbed, which flew in 1940 to validate the push-pull layout before it was committed to a full-scale design. The tests were successful. The layout worked. But the path from successful testbed to production aircraft was not direct. In 1940, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring canceled the D-335 project. The Luftwaffe had other priorities. Germany's air campaign over Britain was in full swing, and the RLM, the German Aviation Ministry, had little interest in investing in novel configurations when existing types seemed sufficient. By 1942, it was clear that existing types were not sufficient. Germany was now at war with the Soviet Union, the United States had entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor, and the arithmetic of attrition was becoming brutally apparent. The RLM reversed its position and asked Dornier to proceed with a multi-role fighter based on the push-pull configuration. The first prototype, designated D335V1, flew on September 26, 1943, under the control of Flugkapitän Hans Dieterle, 3 years and 3 months after the project had been canceled. The test results were immediately impressive and immediately troubling in equal measure. Fast, stable, easy to handle for an aircraft of its size and weight. These were the consistent findings from the DO335 test program, reported by every pilot who flew it in its standard configuration. The aircraft's performance numbers were not theoretical. A DO335 was measured at 763 kilometers per hour, 474 miles per hour, in level flight. Not a dive, not a shallow descent, level flight. At a time when the official FAI world speed record was 469 miles per hour, set by a specially prepared racing aircraft, the DO335 was exceeding it as a production fighter design. On a single engine, with the other shut down, the aircraft could still fly at approximately 620 kilometers per hour. The asymmetric thrust problem that plagued conventional twin-engine fighters simply did not exist. Single-engine flying was described by test pilots as manageable rather than harrowing. The armament was serious. One 30mm Mk103 cannon firing through the propeller hub, two 15mm MG151 cannons above the forward engine cowling. The heavier variants added wing-mounted cannons. A single burst from the Mk103 was sufficient to destroy most Allied aircraft. And the aircraft carried innovations that were years ahead of most production fighters of the period. An ejection seat, not a standard feature on most World War II fighters, where bailing out meant manually climbing over the cockpit edge in a potentially supersonic slipstream. An explosive charge designed to blow the rear propeller and tail fin clear of the aircraft before the seat fired, preventing the pilot from being struck by the spinning rear propeller during ejection. Tricycle landing gear, which made ground handling dramatically easier than the tailwheel configuration used on almost every other piston fighter of the era. But the test program also found problems that would define the aircraft's operational challenges. The rear engine overheated. Mounted inside the fuselage rather than exposed to airflow, the DB603 at the tail position ran significantly hotter than the nose engine, requiring careful management by the pilot and routine cooling periods on the ground. The cooling system was improved during the development program, but it was never fully resolved. The landing gear was weak. The aircraft weighed 9,600 kilograms fully loaded, heavier than a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, and the main gear, designed to be as compact as possible to reduce drag, put that weight on struts that were at the edge of their structural limits on every landing. Landing gear collapses occurred during testing. The gear was strengthened during development but remained a known vulnerability. And the aircraft required very specific maintenance expertise. 2 DB603 engines, the complex push-pull transmission system, the ejection seat mechanism, the explosive tail jettison charge, all of it demanded ground crews with specialized training that took time to develop and resources to sustain. These were manageable problems for a mature production program in a country with intact supply chains, undamaged training facilities, and fuel reserves. By 1944, Germany had none of those things. Production of the D335 was ordered with maximum priority by the RLM in 1944. The designation of maximum priority reflected both how seriously the Luftwaffe took the aircraft's potential and how desperate Germany's situation had become. Maximum priority meant little when the factories producing the D-335's components were being bombed continuously by Allied air forces. The Daimler-Benz facilities supplying the DB603 engines were hit repeatedly. The Dornier assembly facility at Oberpfaffenhofen was targeted. The railroad lines connecting component suppliers to assembly plants were interdicted. German industry in 1944 and 1945 was not a functioning supply chain. It was a collection of dispersed, damaged, constantly disrupted production nodes doing their best to maintain output under conditions that were systematically destroying the infrastructure on which modern industrial production depends. The first D-335s reached conversion training units approximately 10 months before the war ended. Not frontline combat units, conversion training units, where experienced pilots learned to fly a new type before being assigned to operational squadrons. 10 months was barely enough time for pilots to accumulate meaningful hours on the type. The aircraft that received highest priority from Luftwaffe High Command in 1944 entered service just in time to be operated by pilots who were still learning it when Germany collapsed. Only a single production D-335A1, the definitive single-seat fighter-bomber variant, was completed before the war ended. The most telling encounter the D-335 had with Allied aircraft occurred in April 1945, and it tells the story of the program's too late arrival with perfect clarity. French ace Pierre Clostermann was leading a flight of 4 Hawker Tempests, the fastest Allied piston fighter at low altitude, over northern Germany when the formation spotted an unknown aircraft flying at maximum speed at treetop level. The German pilot saw the British aircraft and immediately reversed course to evade. Clostermann, despite the Tempest's considerable low-altitude speed advantage over almost every other aircraft it might encounter, made a specific decision: do not chase. The unknown aircraft was visibly faster than his Tempests. He had no way of knowing what it was. He did not pursue. The aircraft he declined to chase was almost certainly a D-335. In April 1945, with the war days from ending, the fastest piston fighter ever built was evading combat by running away from it because there was nothing left to fight for, no mission worth completing, no outcome the D-335 speed could change. Among the Do-335s at Oberpfaffenhofen in the final days of the war was a test pilot named Hans Werner Lerche. Lerche had flown the Do-335 extensively during the development program and understood the aircraft better than almost any other pilot alive. As Allied forces closed on the factory from multiple directions in late April 1945, Lerche made a series of flights that amounted to something between a test program and a desperate attempt to preserve what he could of the aircraft and the knowledge of how to fly it. On one leg, tracer rounds suddenly passed close to the aircraft, forcing Lerche to push the engines to full power and drop to treetop height. No aircraft caught him, and the engines held, but the incident showed how vulnerable even the fastest aircraft could be at that stage of the war. By the time Lerche reached southern Germany, airfields were being bombed almost continuously. He parked the Do-335 fully expecting it to be destroyed, yet by chance it survived. His final flight took the aircraft to Oberpfaffenhofen, where Dornier personnel watched in surprise as one of their most advanced designs arrived intact just days before the war collapsed completely. The aircraft was assembled at the Dornier plant in Oberpfaffenhofen, Bavaria on 16 April 1945. It was captured by Allied forces on 22 April. Construction number 240102, the second pre-production A0, had been completed 6 days before the Americans arrived. The Americans found the factory intact, or intact enough to be useful. They found Do-335s in various stages of completion, with technical documentation, engineering drawings, and the Dornier personnel who had built them. The intelligence value was significant. The DO-335 represented genuine aerodynamic advances, the push-pull configuration, the ejection seat design, the centerline thrust approach to twin-engine performance that American engineers wanted to understand. Dornier craftspersons, many of them factory employees since World War II, were surprised to find still attached to the aircraft the explosive bolts designed to blow off the tail fin and rear propeller. These had never been disarmed. The aircraft that had been captured intact was still configured for a pilot ejection sequence that had never been needed. Two DO-335s were shipped to the United States for evaluation. They were tested at Freeman Field in Indiana and then at other facilities. The tests confirmed what the German data had shown. The aircraft was fast, stable, and genuinely advanced. But by 1945 and 1946, the jet age was arriving, and the engineering lessons of a piston fighter, however remarkable, were of limited relevance to what American aviation was about to become. After these tests, it was left to rot outside for years. One of the two American DO-335s was eventually scrapped. Construction number 2401012 survived, stored at Naval Air Station Norfolk, deteriorating. The D-335 remained stored at Naval Air Station Norfolk until 1974, when the Smithsonian returned it to Oberpfaffenhofen, Germany, where the Dornier Company preserved and restored the airplane in 1975. This detail deserves to be held for a moment. The aircraft was returned to the factory where it was built, and at that factory in 1975, there were still men working who had worked there in 1945. Men who had been on the production line when construction number 240102 was assembled in April of that year, who had heard the American forces approaching and had expected the aircraft to be destroyed or captured or lost, and who were now, 30 years later, working on its restoration. By a strange quirk of fates, in 1974, the plane was transported back to the factory in Germany to be restored. Some of the men who built it in April 1945 were now restoring her. The restoration they completed was thorough. The airframe was cleaned, stabilized, and repaired where needed. The explosive jettison charges that the Americans had found still armed in 1945 were finally properly dealt with. The aircraft was brought to display condition, not airworthy, but preserved as a complete and accurate example of what the D-335 had been. Following restoration, the completed aircraft was displayed at the Hanover, Germany Air Show from 1 May 1976 to 9 May 1976. After the air show, the aircraft was loaned to the Deutsches Museum in Munich, where it was on display until 1988, when it was shipped back to Silver Hill, Maryland. The aircraft that had been left to rot outside a naval air station had been to Germany and back, had been displayed at an international air show, had spent more than a decade in one of Europe's most significant technical museums, and had returned to the United States, where it would eventually be moved to the Udvar-Hazy Center, the Smithsonian's dedicated aviation and space museum facility at Dulles Airport, where it has been on display ever since. The restoration work done by Dornier in 1975 was the work of people who understood the aircraft from the inside, not from manuals and drawings, but from memory, from having built it. The specific material choices, the specific finishes, the specific way certain components were fitted, these were preserved not just from documentation, but from direct knowledge that existed nowhere else. By the time those workers were gone, the knowledge they carried was in the aircraft. Construction number 240102 is displayed today in the World War II German Aviation Gallery at the Udvar-Hazy Center, alongside two other singular objects, the only known example of the Arado AR-234B2 Blitz jet reconnaissance bomber, and the only complete surviving Heinkel HE-219A Uhu night fighter. 3 aircraft, each representing a category of its own, the only surviving examples of types that were built in the dozens or hundreds, that represented genuine advances in aviation technology, and that arrived too late in a war already decided by the time they reached their units. The Do-335 in that gallery is not a replica. It is not a recreation. It is construction number 240102, the actual pre-production aircraft assembled at Oberpfaffenhofen in April 1945, completed 6 days before the Americans arrived, shipped to the United States, tested, stored, allowed to deteriorate, returned to Germany, restored by the men who built it, displayed at Hanover, loaned it to Munich, and eventually brought back to sit in a climate-controlled hangar in Virginia, where several million people a year walk past it. The aircraft that flew faster than the official world speed record never fired its weapons. It survived the war, a decade of outdoor storage, the scrapping of its companion aircraft, a transatlantic journey, a restoration by its own builders, and 40 years of museum display. It carries on its airframe the specific history of one of the most technically advanced programs of the entire war, a program that produced genuine innovation in engine configuration, crew safety, and performance that was studied by every major aviation power after the war ended. The push-pull configuration the Do-335 embodied was never adopted by post-war production aircraft. Jet engines made the aerodynamic advantages of the layout irrelevant almost immediately. The ejection seat system the Do-335 pioneered was adopted everywhere. The center-line thrust concept was revisited multiple times by designers looking for performance without asymmetrical thrust penalties, each time rediscovering what Claudius Dornier had patented in 1937. What the Do-335 represents, in the end, is not a war-winning weapon. It was never that. It represents what a technically capable industry in a losing war can produce when it has just enough time and just enough resources to complete the design, but not nearly enough of either to deploy it at a scale that matters. 48 aircraft built. 1 survives. It was completed 6 days before the factory was overrun, and the men who built it came back 30 years later to restore it.